Welcome, welcome. See a lot of people sharing their names and organization and roles and pronouns in the chat. Keep them coming. We wish we could go around and share, verbally, but for the sake of time, I think today, if you could use the chat, that would be great. We have a fantastic webinar for you all this afternoon or morning on the West Coast. We're going to be covering an introduction to good food communities and what coalitions all across the country are working on in terms of values-based procurement change. And then we'll turn it over to the principal investigator of this new report, Procuring Food Justice, to talk about why this report and what were some of the key findings of the research. We have a panel discussion of organizers and activists from across the country that are trying to leverage institutional food purchasing for food systems transformation. And then we have time for Q&A, and we'll wrap up with some action steps that we can all take as we leave the webinar today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jose Oliva, who is the campaigns director for the Heal Food Alliance, to talk a little bit about what good food communities is.
Thank you so much, Marley, and thank you to the panelists for agreeing to be here today to share their wisdom with us. And of course, thank you all for taking the time to learn about this pretty groundbreaking study. When we first set out to do work in the public food supply chain over 10 years ago, we were guided by our members at Food Chain Workers Alliance. They insisted that it was possible for us to have an impact, not just on one sector of the food system, but on all five: farm workers, warehouse and distribution workers, processing, retail workers, and restaurant and cafeteria workers. So my former co-director, Joanne Lowe, who I think I saw her name on the list, so she's probably here. Having previously worked at the Garment Worker Center in LA, and an ordinance specifically that bans sweatshop-made uniforms from making their way into the supply chain in Los Angeles, saw a parallel and an opportunity to use a similar model in the food system. Then, together with the LA Food Policy Council and the mayor's office, they expanded on that vision, and together they created the Good Food Purchasing Policy. Now, this policy was not just going to impact workers in the supply chain, but also local economies, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and nutrition. So as innovative and revolutionary, really, as this policy was, it was not the only work happening around the country to leverage food procurement to improve wages, working conditions for farm workers, while curbing environmental havoc caused by these major food corporations. In university campuses all over the US, students led a movement to enact what they call the Real Food Challenge, a similar values-based approach for the food that their universities purchased. In hospitals, we had healthcare without harm, creating a similar model for the food that those institutions purchased. So over the course of the next decade, these three values-based procurement strategies would have an unimaginable impact on their respective institutions. And because of the rapid growth of these policies and programs, we at FEEL and at Food Chain Workers Alliance set out to build local community-based coalitions that gave voice and agency to people directly impacted by these institutions. The goal was, and continues to be, to ensure that the values we need as workers, parents, students, and just community members are reflected in the food our local institutions are purchasing. And this is the effort that we call Good Food Communities. And the challenges remain, right? As a parent of two Chicago public school students, I can say with certainty that despite CPS having adopted and implemented the Good Food Purchasing Program, I'm still unable to know with any amount of certainty where the food on my kid's plate every day comes from. And I don't mean which company is selling the district of food. I mean what specific farm, processing plant, warehouse, etc. And of course, without that information, I don't know if the food that my kids are eating is in fact meeting the standards and the values that we collectively decided as Chicagoans were the values we wanted reflected in our food. So we set out to find out, not just here in Chicago, but all around the country, what were some of the real outcomes and changes we've had in the procurement process, in the institutions that are engaged in values-based procurement, and what is more important, how local communities are engaged and able to have a voice in that process. So it's with great pleasure that I today am here to announce the release of this report entitled Procuring Food Justice, which is based on research that took place over the course of nearly 2 years. Over the next hour and a half, you'll hear from the principal investigator and on the research, as well as a panel of experts, all of which were interviewed and participated in the research and work on the front lines with workers, BIPOC producers, and communities. So once again, thank you all for being here, and I hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jose. Wonderful introduction. I'm going to pass it now along to Winston Moore, who is the research consultant for Good Food Communities and was a chief investigator for the Procuring Food Justice report. And Winston will be sharing a little bit about why this report and what were some of the key findings. So Winston, take it away.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to share this information with you. I will say this is a big report, so there's a lot of stuff to share, and I'll try to touch base on just the key highlights. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. So first of all, why this report? Well, as Jose said, it's been 10 years that we've been working with the GFPP and values-based procurement as a strategy. In that time, the GFPP has influenced over $500 million in public food funds. We have 40 institutions that are now aligned with GFPP, including 15 policy adoptions across 10 different cities. So that's 10 years of understanding from coalitions all over the country in terms of what works and what needs to work better. So our job for the report is to collect that understanding from the individual coalitions and then share that with the broader community. So those coalitions identified a need for progress in 3 areas, and building GFPP as a tool to increase supply chain transparency, to support food worker organizing, and to build BIPOC producer and distributor access to procurement markets. Okay, next slide, please. So the first issue is building supply chain transparency in procurement markets. First off, I want to say that, as Jose noted, procurement markets are incredibly opaque, and corporations love that. They dominate the procurement markets, and they like that because it allows them to dodge accountability. In procurement markets, these corporations run with the same ethos that they do for every other market, which is increase profits and minimize cost. And they're willing to do that even if it means exploiting workers or serving low quality food to vulnerable communities, like people who are sick or elderly in hospitals, to people who are incarcerated, to kids in juvenile detention centers, to kids in schools. And they're in the rush to minimize cost, corporations often sort of skirt the boundary of what is legally permissible, and they fairly regularly go over that boundary as well. So transparency represents a threat to corporate dominance over these procurement markets. And corporations are willing to resist transparency initiatives to mitigate that threat. And they do this in a number of ways that we detail in the report, including treating suppliers like intellectual property, by lobbying against transparency legislation, or by co-opting transparency legislation or programs. And we, in our research for the report, we looked around at programs and policies that were making good progress in terms of transparency, both internationally and domestically, and domestic here in the US, as well as from within and without the food system. And we developed some best practices. The fundamentals of those best practices were mandates, consequences, and enforcement. And that's mandates for full transparency in the supply chain, as well as compliance with labor standards. And consequences for non-compliance, for when corporations do not comply with those mandates. And you need enforcement bodies with the authority to monitor compliance and deliver consequences for those corporations and suppliers that are not compliant with the standards that they set. And it's important to note that many of the best of these programs and policies are led by workers, from workers in those supply chains. And they are best equipped to enforce the standards within these programs when they have tools to do certain things, including meaningful representation and building standards through programs like worker-to-worker education that help workers in these supply chains understand the policies that they're aligned with, as well as the rights that they're afforded, and confidential worker complaint mechanisms, so that workers can let the enforcement bodies know when suppliers are non-compliant. So these issues illustrate the sort of focus areas in our need to protect workers' rights. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So through our research, we saw that workers in GFPP supply chains, like workers everywhere, are subject to their employers, and that corporations, the suppliers for procurement deals, have a record, and we saw it over and over again throughout our research, of targeting vulnerable communities when they're hiring. And they hire folks like H-2A workers and undocumented workers, but also folks from the communities that our public institutions serve, like formerly incarcerated people and alarmingly, children. And so to get a read on the supply chains within GFPP supply chains, we collaborated on some surveys with Warehouse Workers for Justice in the Chicago area, surveying warehouse workers, and as well as collaborating with Farm Workers Association of Florida in Florida, speaking to farm workers there. And we found the same patterns. The more vulnerable worker community is, the more exploited they tend to be. In Chicagoland, that meant that temp workers, who are often formerly incarcerated individuals and do not have the same protections as a full-time employee, temp workers have lower rates of food security and less health coverage. They're more likely to say that their bosses don't respect their right to organize, as well as showing signs that they're more fearful that they can't call in sick, or else they'll lose their job. And in Florida, the farm workers, farm workplaces being some of the least transparent parts of our supply chain, also had serious issues going on there, including those that we found among the warehouse workers, but also higher levels of retaliation, less healthcare, plus exposure to toxic chemicals through pesticide exposure without protections, as well as unsanitary drinking water. Also, it's important to note that the GFPP standards present an incredible opportunity for farm workers in particular, because farm workers in all but 9 states in the US do not have the right to organize. So this is a great opportunity. We also spoke to workers in a meat packing plant, and former workers in a meat packing plant, but Axel will be able to share more about that. So I want to say that labor violations do not tell the full story. So it's important that we're not just relying on OSHA. OSHA is important, but they also have significant lapses in their coverage, including repetitive motion injuries that you see in slaughterhouses. They also don't cover workplaces with fewer than 10 workers on it. So that excludes many farm workers, as well as workers at concentrated animal feeding operations. Excuse me. Also, OSHA is just outfunded. This a quick little bit to illustrate this. Tyson Foods in January of 2022 had $169 million in an escrow account earmarked specifically for litigating settlements. So when they get sued for violations or other issues, that $169 million is more than a fourth of OSHA's entire budget for the year of 2022. So one company alone is giving them a run for their money already. So while OSHA is important, they have a limited capacity, and it's great that workers are actually able to fill some of those gaps if they have the right tools and support, which brings us to connecting workers and community. The GFPP has potential as a worker organizing tool, but workers need to, first of all, know about the program. In the surveys that we conducted in the Chicagoland area, 93% of warehouse workers did not know that they were part of GFPP supply chains. So we need to address that. Workers also need to see evidence that this could be a winning strategy in their organizing campaigns, which will require coalitions to invest in those relationships and invest in the efficacy of this as a campaign tool. So that means helping connect the dots in supply chains. It means leaning on worker analysis when evaluating progress towards program goals. And it means setting up consequences so that suppliers that violate workers' rights are punished in some way. Moving on. Yes, that's right. Okay, so this is the BIPOC producer and distributor access to procurement markets. And I think there's a lot that Elga will be able to tell you later on in terms of the value this is going to bring. But it's important to recognize that the benefits of market access are not a given. The food system that we're dealing with is designed to benefit corporate business models. And they can provide low prices to institutions because the food that they're providing is mass produced and underregulated and unethically sourced. They also have sweetheart deals with their They're most often suppliers. And that legacy of procurement contracts that they built up over the years, because this system was made for them, has given them the connections and money and infrastructure and logistics capabilities so that they can do this and profit off of it. So these benefits are not automatically going to be won over for BIPOC producers and distributors if they have access to these markets. You know, while our food system was being rigged to benefit corporations, it was being rigged against people of color and producers of color and distributors of color. So including systemic exclusion from financial resources, land, water, and political and market connections. So in order to make these procurement contracts lucrative and attractive to BIPOC producers and distributors, measures need to be taken to address the infrastructure gaps resulting from these years of discriminatory policies. And I want to address this idea of helping BIPOC farmers. There's sort of a lazy framework in which addressing these infrastructure gaps can be seen as helping BIPOC producers or BIPOC farmers. First of all, that insinuates this is some kind of charity, and charity, as Dennis Derrick, who I interviewed for this report, said, charity never addresses structural issues, and structural issues are what we need to change here. Secondly, it's critical that BIPOC producers and distributors access procurement markets because they have so much to offer, not because we're doing favors. Elga will be able to speak much more to that, but it's important to understand what the alternative is. I saw somebody here is here from Rockefeller. Well, they had the true cost accounting report that just came out a couple of years ago, and they were showing that for every dollar we're spending in the food system, there's $2 worth or somewhere around there of externalities. So they're stripping twice that value from communities in terms of damage to our health and damage to the planet. And so it's also important to understand that when we say BIPOC producers and distributors, we're not just talking about farmers. We're talking about workers and businesses at every level of the supply chain. Just as we want transparency for all workers at every level, including transportation and warehousing and processing and all that, we also want to make sure that these benefits are reaching workers at that level. And that means long-term financial supports as well as relationship building so that business with an institution is trustworthy. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Winston, for reviewing the report and all of the in-depth findings. Really appreciate your remarks, and I'm so excited to dig into the report itself, which we have put a link in the chat for you all, and we'll relink it as we go. And yes, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go, and we have folks looking at the chat to ensure that we can include them in the Q&A later. But first, we'd like to really address a lot of what Winston was sharing in a panel discussion with organizers from across the country that have been looking at the foods that institutions are purchasing and serving, and really working to see if we can leverage that institutional food spend for transformative food systems change. So with us today, we have Axel Fuentes, who is the director of the Rural Community Workers Alliance. He organizes meat processing workers in Missouri and is a member of the Good Food Communities Coalition. We also have Elga Garcia Garza, the director of Agricultura Cooperative Network in New Mexico. They are on the front lines of both food production, distribution, and aggregation in a food system that is lifting up workers and the environment. We had also hoped that our friend Ribka Gatachu from the Community Food Advocates in New York City would be able to join us today, but unfortunately she's tied up meeting with New York legislators in a statewide push to lift barriers and build pathways for values-based purchasing in New York State. So I am going to do my best to fill in for her as part of the panel and part of the work that we're doing here in Chicago with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council and the Metro Chicago Good Food Purchasing Initiative. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Axel. Axel, how can values-based procurement be a tool for protecting workers, and what's needed for that to happen?
Thank you, Marty. And I'm going to respond in a little bit to your question. First, I'm going to start this with a question for everyone in this webinar today, and I'm really glad to see hundreds of you up here. And it's the question is very simple. Do you know where your food came from? I hope you know, because it's very important. Do you know if your orange juice came from Florida? Now with one of the most anti-immigrant laws in this country? Or came from, where came? Do you know that immigrants are the backbone of the food processing or food harvesting? Immigrants and refugees are getting injured out there and sacrificing their lives for us to have something in our tables. Do you know Francisco? Francisco got injured in his shoulder, and he makes 15,700 cuts, meat cuts, in an 8-hour shift in a pork processing plant. 2 weeks ago, Francisco reported feeling pain on his shoulder, and he went to the nurse station in a pork processing plant up here in Milan, and the nurse rubbed him with a pain cream, his shoulder. He never felt any relief. So finally, after fighting with the nurse and just asking for to them to be sent to the doctor, they made an appointment to the company doctor. The company doctor examined him and sent him to get an MRI, and the doctor said, well, you have a bursitis and tendonitis. And he said, well, it's probably because you play basketball. He didn't actually took it as a work-related injury. His shoulder is injured, and now he is he's disabled because he cannot longer work. But they didn't take the responsibility. So I know that you probably, definitely, you don't know Francisco, but I know that you really care about food justice, and that's why you are here today. And over the 15 years, I've been in this community that is being called Milan in northern Missouri, organizing workers from a pork processing plant. And I've been in other communities also, very close to meat processing plants. And I have here, every day I hear stories of being injured, being discriminated, being raped, being abused by managers or supervisors, and hundreds of workers getting injured every day by repetitive motion on the work line. Has been many stories. People that were not able to take bathroom breaks. People that are wearing diapers because They cannot, they are not allowed to take bathroom breaks, so they have to soil on their pants. A lot of urinary tract infections. A lot of the workers that sometimes they don't take their medicines because they don't want to drink water because later they have to ask for permission to go to the bathroom, and they cannot abandon the work line when they need it. And as a Winston was saying, we have a big problem in our policies. We have a big problem in our laws. And even a lot of institutions that are or supposed to be responsible to address health and safety, they are also tied up. They have their hands tied up. If I go back a little bit just for repetitive motion, we don't have any kind of standards. That means it's all up to the companies. The companies can speed up the work line as much as they want. And they can make the workers to process as many pieces of meat per minute or to elaborate as much and as many as they want. It's all up to the company. There is nothing that is regulating the amount of repetitive motions that the workers can do per minute. That's why Francisco is injured today. Can you imagine just that number yesterday when I was talking to him, making the numbers, 15,700 in a work day. So do you know it's 1.6 seconds for every cut. So that means he's working really, really fast. However, there is nothing to protect him. Same thing at bathroom breaks. There are regulations about how many toilets or urinals the building needs to have according to the number of workers in that building. But there is nothing that actually can be enforceable if the employer do not allow the workers to take bathroom breaks. We don't have that. So now I'm going to respond to your question, Marley. That's why this is being developed. Why? How this can be used? Because this is a really powerful tool that Food Chain and Heal Workers Alliance have developed to be an amazing and powerful tool for the workers when they started a campaign or when they are fighting for something, when they are fighting for any way how to address their issues in the workplace. So that's how we utilize this. That's how this can be an amazing tool for that. Because in this case, whoever is buying the meat, whoever is buying the produce, either if it's an institution, either if it's a hospital or a school district, you have the power. The buyer has a lot of power to actually request that the workers in the meat industry or in the food processing industry can improve the working conditions for them. So I think I'm running out of time, but I really want to appreciate that all of you are here, and I wish I could share more stories and more of the things that the food workers are facing everywhere. It's not only in Milan, Missouri. That means it's in the food industry, in the whole food industry, because that's where we are going with the mass production of food. As bigger is the company, more risks the workers are facing to get injured or to have accidents. And hey, also, as bigger the company is, bigger is the amount of food that they are processing, and it's a lot of risk that that food is actually bringing human blood, because in the work line, they can stab at each other because they are working really fast and there is not enough time to put the knives in each cases. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Axel. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much for all of the organizing that you do. And we will have time for Q&A with Axel in a minute, but do want to also hear from Elga as well. So for Elga, again, who's the director of the Agricultura Cooperative Network in New Mexico, we wanted to ask you about how small-scale BIPOC producers and distributors are uniquely equipped to address the needs of communities, and what are some barriers for BIPOC producers currently in participating in values-based purchasing from institutions. How, what are the barriers for them supplying those markets, and what's needed to change in order to build mutually beneficial relationships between local BIPOC producers and community meal program settings. So I'll turn it over to you. Elga, you're muted. There we go. Oh, you're still muted. Okay.
I'd like to thank Heel and Winston for the opportunity to be part of this report. And what I bring to you all is our story here in New Mexico. I come from the South Valley of New Mexico, and the South Valley has a long history of agricultural practices. And I know the new buzzwords are sustainable and regenerative, but our indigenous native people have always been sustainable and regenerative in our land-based practices of growing food, feeding our communities, taking care of the earth and each other. So with that, like everything, it starts with an idea, a theory, which is now a theory of change. And for us, we started because we were at our last generation of traditional farmers. Why? Because they could not make a living on their farms anymore. So generations started to get educated through universities and take other fields, and our land was up in jeopardy. Our water rights were up in jeopardy. We're always told, oh, you come from a disadvantaged community, but they never say why. Land was stolen. Seeds became compromised. Water became a commodity. And land grab was part of the genocide. But we're still here. We're still holding on to land. We're still holding on to traditional ways of growing food and taking care of each other. So here in the South Valley, we started back in 2009. 2008, with the resurgence of traditional farming practices, a year program of a farm training program with one of our elder leaders, Don Bustos, that came and took several farmers, young farmers, under his wing for 1 year. In 2009, we formed the cooperative out of that farm training program. It had 3 cooperative farmers here in the South Valley. And we had this idea of the resurgence of our traditional farming and a way to keep our food local and to build an economy, which was the main source of community health, wealth, and well-being. So now we're a cooperative of 57 farms. We're a network of 57 farms, small scale farmers. When I say small scale, I mean 1/4 of an acre, a hoop house. The majority of the farms are 3 acres. Very few reaching 8, and very few reaching about 14 acres of land. We work with a lot of our native Pueblo farmers as well. So for us, it was the idea, how do we keep our produce local, and how do we take that competitive edge off of the mindset of how we're going to distribute food? how we're going to market our food. We knew early on, early on, that the institutional buyers were crucial to our survival if we really wanted to push this theory of change forward. So in 2010 came the first legislative funding for local investment through public education department. First thing we had to do is, and it was not even a lot of money, it was 107,000 for the whole entire state. So what we did here in the Albuquerque region is we had to meet with the nutrition directors. We had to review the menu. If we're really going to make this work, we have to come together.
Hold on.
We have to come together. And so we reviewed the menus. Like, no, we can't give you papayas and mangoes, but we can give you cherries. We can give you apples. We can give you apricots. We can, you know, the fruit that we have that grows here locally. They had to understand New Mexico's farming practices and our harvesting patterns. And we used the temperatures of the state. Up north, it's much more colder. Down south, it's a lot hotter. So that was our first step. We had to understand what real procurement meant if it was going to work. It was a partnership. And then what we learned throughout those years is that we also had to educate. And it continues to this day as we keep building those institutional investments. We had to educate them out of the mindset of the global corporate food system that they were accustomed to, where they could get whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, at the cheapest, lowest price, for the quickest, the fastest, the cheapest type of production in food service. We learned a lot in those first years working with public education department. And it also helped us build our model, as now we have investment from senior nutrition sites, early childhood centers, hospitals, clinics, RX food as medicine programs, all of that local investment that it takes. So even with the hospitals, that education continued. And you think being healthcare facilities, they would understand how important nutrition is in the healing process. Arguments over, always the farmers had to make the adjustments. The farmers had to make the changes. The farmers had to make the sacrifices. And in leading those discussions, we said, we will never, ever, ever sell our organic produce, carrots for 23 cents a pound. That will never happen. And also keeping them accountable. One important thing, I know I'm running out of time, is we have to keep a balance. As we keep asking for more investment, and in 2022, 2023, we, at the legislative level, we received the most highest funding in the history of New Mexico for food hunger investment. In 2022, it was almost $27 million that went directly into local purchasing. In 2023, almost $57 million for local investment in food production, food security. Now, our work, or my work, our organization's work has been to keep it all equitable, real, and calling out repeated patterns, because that's what happens. As we're getting this money, we're the farmers collecting the data, presenting it before committees and legislation. But yet when the money is released, it goes to, those are where the repeated patterns happen, to the privileged, call it out, white farmers, organic farmers, that have all the capital to make it happen for their businesses. Here we're working on a collectiveness of food security. And we're working on agricultural practices that take care of the earth, that take care of our limited water resources. We collect seed collectively together as one of the ways we address climate change factors. We keep our production local as well, not to participate in that carbon blueprint. So for us, it's that whole working together as we keep getting more funding, institutional funding, more local investment. We also have to make sure that our food hubs have the capacity. We have to make sure our farmers are growing in capacity in order to produce. And mostly we have to make sure that we are keeping true to our mission in how we protect the earth, the people that are growing food, and what are we going to leave to the next generation in order to continue this seed that we have planted right now in procurement practices. So I know my time is up. I really don't want to go over. There's many others to speak, but this has been a long journey for us, and also a very profitable one for all of our farmers. We have outgrown our space. Here at the South Valley Economic Development Center, we move anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 pounds weekly of New Mexico grown fruits, vegetables, and meat, and all of it harvested, grown organically with organic methods, not only to the product itself, but to the earth and to us that consume it. Tlatsukamati Inclaneshka Intonatiu.
Wow, so inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing, Elga. And I know there's going to be lots of questions to address in our Q&A, because I just am so, I mean, this is really what drives the work that we're doing in Chicago too, is seeing that it can be possible. We can connect community meal programs to local farmers and build a mutually beneficial relationship where the community is being served amazing, incredible food, and farmers are benefiting. And so I just, I think all of us on this webinar really have the imperative to go out and help grow this work. As I mentioned, I'm going to share a little bit about the role of coalitions and organizing around institutional food procurement change. And I'm filling in for Rivka Getachew in New York, who couldn't be with us today. But I'll share a little bit from Chicago and hopefully help do this topic justice. So next slide. The Chicago Food Policy Action Council is one of many partners that's helping to steward along the Metro Chicago Good Food Purchasing Initiative here. And we use the acronym GFPI. I'll try to avoid using acronyms, but the Good Food Purchasing Initiative works to ensure that the places feeding our communities purchase and serve food that advances a good food system for all. So accessible, equitable, racially just, healthy, fair, local, humane, and sustainable, all these values that we as a community really care about. Next slide. So this initiative actually started with the City of Chicago and Cook County governments both adopting the Good Food Purchasing Program as a policy resolution. And so the Chicago Department of Public Health and the Cook County Department of Public Health were really tasked with helping to coordinate the Good Food Purchasing Program implementation within the two governments. And then the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, which had been instrumental in helping to advocate for this policy, was kind of written in to support, provide technical assistance to the the Good Food Purchasing Program implementation. So really this mandate, this commitment of both City of Chicago meal programs and Cook County run meal programs, that they would start shifting their food to foods that were local, sustainable, healthy, fair, humane, and really centered racial equity, accountability, and transparency at the center of that food purchasing change. We started kind of collaborating across the two jurisdictions back in 2018, 2019, and realized that, we could work better together and address, make this policy implementation more effective if we were collaborating and cooperating with one another, which led to an initial theory of change for the Good Food Purchasing Initiative back in 2019. And after a very lengthy process of bringing lots of partners together, a 3-year strategic plan that we finished in 2021. I'm sorry, I'm going so fast to fit all of this in. I will slow down for our interpreters. Just wanted to highlight that really, why are we building a coalition? We're building a coalition because policy implementation alone is really not enough to achieve the goals that we have as a community. We need to build an ecosystem that where there's clear leadership by those most impacted by institutional food change. So meal program recipients, frontline food workers, and Black and Brown local food producers that are really informing how we choose to use our resources, our time, and our energy around the good food purchasing change. So that's really first and foremost the reason why we've built this coalition. But we also have recognized that we need to change other procurement laws and processes and procedures in order to enable institutions to actually shift their food spend. So that's really been a huge focus of our work as a coalition, is really identifying how can we best support an enabling environment for institutions to make these changes. And then we know that if we aren't intentionally developing a more equitable supply chain that can meet the demands by our local institutions for local, sustainable, equitably produced food, then the profits of that demand are going to go to the same actors that control our food system right now, which is very consolidated and corporatized. So we're really looking to leverage the Good Food Purchasing Program that our public institutions in Chicago and Cook County have adopted to use that food spend to help invest in local projects that are supporting food workers, local Black and Brown producers and growers and suppliers. And then we're calling in and inviting hospitals and colleges and other community anchor institutions to join us in sharing this vision for shifting their food spend towards a values-based food system as well. Here are some of the current organizations that are involved in coordinating these efforts across institutions and helping us with building a really robust research agenda to support this work. And then the next slide, we have the names of many of our coalition partners that are involved in leveraging the policies that our public institutions have committed to really leverage that so that it really supports frontline food workers and BIPOC producers and meal program recipients. So yeah, I think just wanted to, reiterate the importance of building a coalition so that this work is really held accountable, that it's more effective when we're all working on it together, and that there's shared leadership from those that are most impacted by the foods that are purchased and served by institutions, really at the center of decision making. And I know we are running up against time, so I do want us to get to Q&A, and I know there's been many, many good questions already exchanged in the chat. Keep them coming. We'll try to address the ones that we can with the time we have left. I did just want to call out that we have a couple of other Good Food Communities members in the audience and wanted to tap on them if they wanted to share some additional words in response to the panelists and the webinar so far. So I believe that we have Tommy Carden, a fellow member of the Metro Chicago Good Food Purchasing Initiative here. He's a food justice organizer for Warehouse Workers for Justice, which is also a member of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Tommy, any thoughts that you'd like to share as we're compiling the Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely, Marley. Thank you. Hi, everybody. As Marley said, my name is Tommy Carden. I'm an organizer at Warehouse Workers for Justice, based here in the Chicagoland area. And yeah, just a few thoughts as I've been kind of hearing all the panelists, present on different perspectives as it comes to the Good Food Purchasing Program and how we can make it more effective. At WWJ, we always ask, right, how can workers use GFPP as a tool, right, as they're kind of coming together and organizing for safer workplaces. And, thinking back to what Jose said in his intro at the top of the webinar, wanting to know about where the food comes from, right, that his children are eating in their public schools. I was thinking about how workers right now, right, a lot of workers who are working on farms, in processing facilities, in warehouses, in retail settings, or in restaurants that are selling to public institutions, they don't know, right? And if workers don't know, right, they're covered by the Good Food Purchasing Program, they can ensure, right, the program is fulfilling its intended purposes. And as Winston said, right, workers are best equipped to enforce the standards. So workers really do need to know if they're in supply chains of companies that are participating in the Good Food Purchasing Program. Also, just want to kind of really highlight again something Winston said from the survey results for this report. 93%, right, of warehouse workers that were surveyed, that Warehouse Workers for Justice assisted on the surveys of, said they didn't know, right? They didn't know what the program was. And of the 7% who did, I'm fairly confident that the vast majority of that 7% knew about it through, education of the Worker Center, education that WWJ has done, other groups have done to sort of educate workers about the program. But last thought, and then I'll stop, is that, as we've heard and kind of Axel really highlighted from the experience of workers he's worked with, for warehousing and other food industries, right? The secrecy of these industries, it's really a feature, not a bug. And the consequence of not having this transparency is abuse occurs, right? And unfortunately, abuse is being subsidized, right, by a lot of public money. And the GFPP, right, was initially designed to address this. And now, I'm really excited to be discussing this and kind of using these report findings to see the opportunities that, we all have now to really address this transparency issues, because workers can use the Good Food Purchasing Program if they know it applies to them, but they can't if they don't, right? So just wanted to add that in there.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Really appreciate those thoughts. And it's absolutely part of the work we're trying to do here in Chicago in building a food worker rights and livelihood project to share information about the good food purchasing policy with food chain workers across Metro Chicago. But yeah, thank you. And then we also have Jess Gilbert Overland in the audience as well, who is the campaign director for the Good Food Buffalo Coalition. The coalition is a dynamic coalition based in Buffalo, New York, and also supports the statewide coalition effort to lift barriers to values-based procurement across New York State as well. So Jess, I don't know if you can come off mute and share some thoughts as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone. I don't really want to share my own thoughts. I just want to keep listening to everybody else because I'm learning so much and just so grateful to share space with you all. But I think one thing I wanted to lift up, and it really builds upon Winston's points and Dennis Derrick's points as well. I heard that quote come through and was really appreciating the point about when we are thinking about supporting BIPOC producers, we need to think a little bit broader beyond simply supporting farmers in and of themselves, but also shifting some of those bigger systems and structures that perpetuate oppression and discrimination in our food system. And so from the Good Food Buffalo Coalition's perspective, we've really been focused on racial justice since the beginning of our coalition in 2018, and that's enabled us to learn quite a bit about some of these systems and structures of oppression that we need to shift or even transform, I would argue, to really support our BIPOC producers and to provide opportunities for those BIPOC producers who are interested in accessing institutional markets. And so just to share a couple of examples that we've identified, access to land, capital, and technical assistance, of course, are examples that come up as very regularly as barriers that BIPOC producers experience. And so thinking more deeply about how to overcome some of those barriers, what are some of the systems and structures that need to be changed to increase access to those needed resources. And one example that has really come up for our coalition lately is looking at minority and women-owned business enterprise policy as a policy example that is uplifted often as an example of racial justice and how we can center racial justice in institutional procurement, but in reality is actually extremely exclusionary and very problematic. And so often we need to look at some of these policies and bigger structures, and please forgive my dog who's sitting next to me and making noises. But some of these systems that really need to be changed. And so thinking about Ribka and Taylor, for example, advocating for policy at the New York State level today and weren't able to join us, and including language for socially disadvantaged farmers that remove some of those exclusionary barriers that MWBE policies present and offer unrestricted pathways for BIPOC producers to enter institutional markets. Also thinking about infrastructure development, how institutions could provide steady sources of capital for BIPOC producers if we could increase the amount of money that our institutions can pay folks. But right now that money is so limited and our budgets are so restricted, and policy like lowest responsible bidder laws really do restrict how much we can pay our BIPOC producers, therefore rendering it kind of pointless for folks to try to enter our institutional supply chains at this moment. So those are just some things that I've been mulling over and that our coalition has been learning as we've been moving along. But thank you so much for letting me share those reflections and for everybody else sharing your thoughts too.
Thank you so much, Jess. So we do have a lot of great questions coming in from the chat. We have a question from Jessica Brennan asking around data and communication for institutions and advocates that are on board with supporting workers' rights in food procurement. How do I identify or find businesses that have good practices, especially businesses that supply or can aggregate food at the level an institution needs? And that's a great question. I'm curious if any of our speakers wanted to tackle that question to get us started. I can chime in and say that this is one of the things that we've been working on in Chicago is building out buyer supplier mixer events, because while there are online directories of local values aligned farms and food businesses, not all producers that are listed in those directories are necessarily ready to sell or, quite prepared to sell to institutional markets at the moment. And we really want to start off these relationship building efforts with dialogue on how, as Elga was talking about, we can, there's certain things that both parties can't compromise on, but let's have a conversation about how we can work together first. So we've found having relationship building events has been really valuable to go beyond just having an online directory of particular values aligned products or food businesses that institutions can buy from. Although, you know, there is a space for that kind of technology, and the Center for Good Food Purchasing that runs the Good Food Purchasing program, they do maintain a list of values aligned products that institutions across the country have purchased to meet their good food purchasing standards thus far. So it is a benefit of being in the Good Food Purchasing program as an enrolled institution. Any others that would like to chime in on that question of finding good sources of food?
Well, I can only speak for New Mexico and what we're doing here within our state. And we are sharing a lot of that value-based data. What farms, how many farms, how much do they produce? And we also work with other mission-driven food hubs in our state, and we help each other. Because we are here in the urban rural setting, and we are organized with a network and cooperative of farms, we also hold that responsibility to provide that information and share that information. And also participating in settings like this that's happening right now with this webinar is one of the most best communication tools and resources that we can also build on. In participating in webinars such as this, telling our story, has connected us with providing food in Alaska, has been providing, you know, and I'm not talking fresh food, I'm talking about our value added production, our shelf stable, our beans, our chicos, all of those others that products that we can produce. And we are looking for wider markets. So for us here, I think, and being collectively, like you're talking about building your coalition, also within the coalition that HEAL builds and many other platforms that are working around food, agriculture, hunger, health, all of those pieces, is also the best way to connect. And it's really up to us to make that connection more stronger. We're always building movement wherever we are. So this is no different than that. We have to build it. We have to nourish it. We have to make those relationships. We have to learn from each other. So there's no magic place where you can just press a button and boom, it's all going to appear, because we're movement building people within food security.
Thank you, Elga. We had another question from Annabelle around how does GFPP work with larger labor unions like the UFCW, and if there's room for collaboration between labor unions and the work that we're all trying to do around good food purchasing policy change.
There certainly is a lot of collaboration between not just the large labor unions like UFCW or WDSU, but also smaller worker centers. You heard earlier from Axel Fuentes, who is the director of the Rural Community Workers Alliance, which is a small worker center in rural Missouri. But with the larger unions, the relationship has been really fruitful because we can identify, for instance, a particular player in the supply chain, like let's say Tyson, and then we know, or we can know, how many members of UFCW work at a Tyson plant, and thus that gives us a direct vehicle for communication with those workers. It's a little bit different when workers don't have a union. You can't really communicate with those workers except going through the employer. So it's more challenging. And obviously this benefits large labor unions in a more direct way, because they can identify specific companies that are part of a supply chain to a particular institution. And if that institution is signed on to the good food purchasing policy, they can then leverage that institution's contract to ensure that the company is not union busting, for instance, right? Or that they're not abusing the National Labor Relations Act. But yeah, I hope I got to your question.
I will also add, because I saw that Winston had also put, we were one of the first in New Mexico to receive GAP certification, Good Agricultural Practices, the highest level of food safety that can be attained. And we attained and maintained that certification for 3 years. That was a very important piece as we're moving into corporate investment. And we've been on a campaign for the past 6 years, also trying to make that connection of getting our food within dollar stores, specifically Dollar General. And people say, why dollar stores? Because for many, Albuquerque is the biggest city in New Mexico. We're surrounded by villages and pueblos. So the majority of our communities, even here within the urban setting, dollar stores are the only grocery store to be had. So it was very important for us to, number one, do our work on chemical policy reform within those dollar stores, taking out toxic products, calling that piece out. And now we're pushing them, asking them to be good neighbors and invest in our communities. We also work at the state level on transportation. And these are when I said we work with mission-driven food hubs, that's what we do. We transport, we share, we go down south, we bring product from down south to the central, then the southeastern, western part of the state, we meet in northern New Mexico, and then they take product that way. So all of those infrastructures, no, we're not talking about big labor or anything like that, but we're talking about how do we organize all of those pieces that come under labor union practices, the collectiveness of how we're going to take care and speak for ourselves and keep building the infrastructure through the self-determination of people. So I think that's also another avenue of looking at this question. How are we doing it differently now? What did we learn and how can we organize it differently?
Oh, Elga, I think we lost your audio. There we go.
Okay, I don't know where I went off, but it's also looking at it at a different way of organizing and supporting, another lens from big union to how do we organize ourselves in a collective when we are dealing with health, environment, agriculture, and labor. And again, I only bring the experience of what we have been able to do in New Mexico, once again, by speaking for ourselves, by holding the navigation for ourselves, and through the self-determination of people.
Thank you, Elga. We only have a minute left for one more Q&A question. But Navina had a great one around the challenges in accessing supply chain data and just the general lack of transparency and how we're all trying to work around that. So I think Axel, is that one that you might want to take? You're muted, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Well, transparency, that's a really powerful question, especially when it's about food. I don't think exists transparency with the food, especially the big food processors. I can tell you an example why I don't believe that exists transparency. Because in many cases, if we say, for example, accidents, even when exists something that the OSHA, for example, have the log on 300, where they have to report accidents, the company usually does not do that because they have different ways how they categorize the injuries. And in many cases, they say, well, it's a minor injury. That's one example. Another example is that I can tell you what I hear from workers up here regarding food safety. For example, when the conveyor belt is bringing a piece of meat with abscess, you're talking infection, you're talking about pus. I mean, it's an infection there. And that is getting caught, and all the pus spreads on the conveyor belt. Due to the high speed that the workers are actually elaborating the pieces of meat, they cannot stop the work line. So that's all they do is just wipe with their hands and just keep working. However, that is not reported. That is a contamination out there. And in a story that I hear from this woman, that she works as a quality control up there, and I was asking her, why do you do not stop the line when it is an abscess up there in the conveyor belt? And she said, well, because I don't want to get terminated, because I have to stop the line, make the cleaning crew to come and clean up, and then I have to test it that there is no more contamination on the conveyor belt. But if I do that, the company doesn't like, because they claim that they are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I can get terminated. And as you know, a lot of the institutions, sometimes they turn their affairs on the other side too, because they don't want to get terminated. I will say that these corporations became so powerful that they are just manipulating all the levels. So that's why I don't see that exists actually transparency. But, and when I was speaking, that's why I said, if you buy from a big company, you have more chances that your food is contaminated. But if you buy from a smaller producer, I have seen in one case, one of my friends that is a farmer, the inspector is going to inspect every single unit of chickens, for example. In this case, it was a chicken. But in a big corporations, it's just random samples. That's why you hear in many cases, for example, in meat, they do the recalls because the meat is contaminated with something. But in many cases, that meat is already sold. So right now, it doesn't exist transparency regarding that, but can exist. It can exist through programs like GFPP, for example, if we actually pursue that. So I don't know if that actually answered the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Axel. Yes, very good points on just how challenging the transparency piece is. We're so sorry we can't get to all of the questions in the Q&A. We'll try to follow up with you post-webinar and address them in the chat. I'm going to pass it over now to Christina Spock, who is the Food Campaigns Director for the Food Chain Workers Alliance, on some action steps from today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Marley. Hi, everybody. I'll briefly share some highlights from the report's recommendation section that will define the actions needed for the road ahead. But first, just want to give a shout out to Axel and Elga, Marley, Tommy, Jess, to everyone on the ground doing this work that has defined the report and also the last decade of our procurement work. It's these folks, our members, our partners of the Good Food Communities campaign, that have co-developed the recommendations to support local organizing, policy making, and implementation. And basically, in broad strokes, here's what we know we need. From institutional partners, we know they've had a greater impact when grassroots leaders and workers and BIPOC producers are recognized as the experts that they are and trusted as critical partners in implementing values-based procurement. We know that they're successful when public institutions require supplier transparency and when there's consequences created and enforced for violating suppliers. Moving on to the next slide, we also know that good food policies are pivotal to ensuring the long-term commitment and success of public institutions. So policymakers really play a key role. And we've learned that we need policies that mirror these actions that we want to see from our institutional partners. So that means advancing policies that equipped institutions with authority to give preference in their contracting to suppliers with fair labor practices and to suppliers who are BIPOC producers. We know that we need policies that require suppliers share their sourcing data, tracing all the way back to the farm level, and also policies that embolden institutions to cut those contracts with violating suppliers. And in order to have transparent supply chains, we obviously need suppliers to be sharing that sourcing data and that of their subcontractors. So we know that full supply chain, right? And lastly, the grassroots leaders on the ground building public support, cultivating lasting partnerships, the folks who are providing healthy accountability takes tremendous amount of resources. And so funders are also key in ensuring that there's financial resources invested in long-term community and worker organizing. So in this report, we dive deeper with a roadmap for building out those outcomes locally, what we think it's going to take. And as we move into the next chapter of Good Food Communities, these recommendations are really guiding our collective work, right? To build true accountability by gaining access to who our public suppliers are, building consequences for suppliers who undermine our collective values, protecting and supporting worker organizing that in turn enforces fair supply chain practices, and also securing support and contracts for BIPOC producers. So feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you have, or if you'd like to discuss further how to implement these recommendations locally. And I'll hand it over to Marley.
Thank you all so much for joining us again. The most immediate direct action item from this webinar is to download the report, give it a read, share it with others, especially institutional partners. And thank you again so much for being with us. And on the screen, you'll see we have the website up and live right now. So read the report, and we'll follow up with the link to the recording and to address some of the lingering Q&A and provide the slides with you all shortly.
Thank you.